The global ledger is a work of fiction. From Washington to Tokyo, the world's superpowers are drowning in $320 trillion of red ink, 3 times the value of everything on Earth. If every nation is broke, we must ask the one question the financial system isn't designed to answer. How is the world still getting paid, and whose future is being sold to fund the present? The United States currently owes $34 trillion. That is more than the value of every company on the S&P 500 combined. It is a number so large it has lost all meaning. If you spent $1 every second, it would take you over 1 million years to pay it back. But here is the question that breaks the logic of the modern world. If everyone owes, who exactly gets paid? We are told China owns us. We are told the elite own us. But the truth is far more circular, far more mundane, and far more dangerous. The answer isn't a shadow government. The answer is you, your pension, your bank account, and your future. Today, we are following the $34 trillion trail to the only place it can end, to the moment the trust breaks. To understand who America owes, we have to stop thinking about debt as a suitcase full of cash. In the world of high finance, debt isn't a burden, it's a product. It is the most successful, most traded, and most important product in human history. It's called the U.S. Treasury bond. Every time the U.S. government decides to spend money it doesn't have, whether for a new aircraft carrier, a bridge in Ohio, or a stimulus check, it doesn't just ask for a loan. It holds an auction. These are the primary dealers. They are the gatekeepers. When the Treasury needs $50 billion on a Tuesday morning, these banks are legally required to show up and bid. But they aren't buying these bonds to keep them in a vault. They are buying them to sell them to you. Why? Because a Treasury bond is a financial time machine. If you have $10 million today, you have a problem. Risk. If you put it in a hole in the ground, inflation eats it. If you put it in a bank, the bank might fail. If you put it in the stock market, it might crash. But if you give it to the US government, they promise to give it back in 10, 20, or 30 years with interest. Because the US has the power to tax 330 million people and the world's most powerful military to back its currency, that promise is considered the risk-free rate. This is the grand illusion behind the world's richest nations. Every pension fund in London, every insurance company in Munich, and every savings account in New York is built on the assumption that this piece of paper is better than gold. In 1971, when President Nixon severed the link between the dollar and gold, he didn't just change the currency, he turned the US Treasury into a debt factory. Before 1971, the government was disciplined by how much yellow metal was in Fort Knox. After 1971, the only limit was trust. Between 1971 and today, the debt didn't just grow, it evolved. It became the oil that greases the gears of global trade. When a Japanese car manufacturer sells a sedan in California, they don't want to hold on to cash dollars that lose value every day. They want an asset that pays interest. So they buy a treasury bond. When a pension fund in Norway wants to ensure they can pay retirees in 2050, they buy a treasury bond. This means the $34 trillion isn't just a bill waiting to be paid, it is the global reserve asset. But here is where the experts' logic begins to fail. If the world is buying these bonds because they are safe, what happens when the mountain of debt becomes so high that the interest alone starts to consume the country? We've established what the debt is. Now we have to look at the first major holder of this $34 trillion. And I promise you, it isn't who you think. It isn't a foreign rival. It isn't a billionaire. It's a ghost in the machine. A system where the government is legally obligated to rob its own future to pay for its present. If you ask the average person who the US owes money to, they might point to a map. They'll point to Beijing, Tokyo, or perhaps a shadowy boardroom in Zurich, but they are looking in the wrong direction. To find the largest single creditor of the United States, you don't need a passport. you need a mirror. Nearly 1/3 of the $34 trillion debt, roughly $12 trillion, is what economists call intragovernmental holdings. In plain English, the government has spent your future to pay for its past. For decades, the Social Security lockbox has been the greatest marketing campaign in political history. The narrative was simple. You pay your payroll taxes, the government puts that money in a trust fund, and when you retire, that cash is waiting for you. It is a lie. There is no vault in Washington filled with $2.7 trillion in cash. There are no stocks of gold bars labeled retirement. There are only filing cabinets in Parkersburg, West Virginia, containing sheets of paper. These are special series Treasury bonds. Here is how the Parasite works. When the Social Security Administration collects more in taxes than it pays out in benefits, it has a surplus. By law, it cannot just hold that cash. It must lend that cash to the U.S. Treasury. The Treasury takes the cash and immediately spends it. It pays for fighter jets, it pays for federal salaries, it pays for interest on other debts. In exchange, it gives the Social Security Trust Fund a digital IOU. This is the financial equivalent of a family taking money out of their child's college fund to pay the electric bill, then putting a sticky note in the jar saying, "We'll pay you back later." As long as more young people were working than old people were retiring, the jar stayed full of sticky notes and the lights stayed on. But the rich world is getting older. And now the baby boomer generation is retiring in record numbers. Now, for the first time in decades, the Social Security Administration needs that cash back. They are taking those sticky notes to the Treasury and saying, "Redeem these." But the Treasury doesn't have the cash. To pay back the internal parasite, the government has only 3 choices. 1. Tax the workers more. 2. Cut the benefits for the retirees. 3. Borrow even more money from the outside world to pay itself back. This is why the debt feels invisible. It's because it's a debt we owe to our future selves. It's a mortgage on the year 2040 taken out in 1995. But the $12 trillion we owe ourselves is only the beginning, because to keep this internal loop from collapsing, the US has had to find partners across the ocean, partners who aren't family, partners who have their own agendas. We are moving from the internal parasite to the foreign hostage, because if America owes itself $12 trillion, it owes the rest of the world something much more dangerous: control. If the United States is a snake eating its own tail, the rest of the world is the cage keeping the snake alive. We are told a terrifying story that China owns America, that at any moment Beijing could call in the debt and bankrupt the United States overnight. It is a story used by politicians to trigger fear, but the reality is much stranger and much more calculated. America doesn't just owe the world $8 trillion. America has invited the world into a financial suicide pact. Meet the 2 largest foreign creditors, Japan and China. Japan holds over $1.1 trillion. China holds roughly $800 billion. For decades, these nations have been the primary engines of the American lifestyle. When you buy a Japanese car or a Chinese-made smartphone, those dollars don't just stay in Tokyo or Beijing. They come right back to Washington. This is the mercantilist trap. Japan and China need the US consumer to keep buying their goods. To keep their own currencies cheap and their exports competitive, they take the dollars they earn and plow them right back into US Treasury bonds. By doing this, they aren't just lending money, they are ensuring that their biggest customer, the American public, can afford to keep buying. But here is the question that keeps central bankers awake at night. What happens if they stop? If China decided to dump their $800 billion in debt tomorrow, the value of the US dollar would crash. Interest rates in the US would skyrocket. The American economy would enter a tailspin, but China would suffer more. If the dollar crashes, the Chinese yuan becomes incredibly expensive. Their factories would stop. their 1.4 billion people would face mass unemployment. Their own wealth, held in those very bonds, would evaporate. In the language of modern markets, this is called liquidity. In the real world, we call it a hostage situation. The world holds US debt not because they trust the US government's spending habits, but because they have no other choice. There is no other market large enough, deep enough, or safe enough to hold $8 trillion of global savings. Except, for the first time in 50 years, the cracks are starting to show. Since 2022, the foreign hostages have started looking for the exit. China has been quietly slashing its holdings of US treasuries, reaching its lowest level in over a decade. They aren't just selling, they are swapping. They are trading US paper for hard gold. If the world decides it no longer needs the US Treasury bond to facilitate trade, the hostage pact ends. And when the world stops buying the debt, there is only one buyer left, a buyer who doesn't have any money at all. We are entering the final stage of the debt cycle, when the American public can't fund the debt and the foreign powers won't fund the debt. The US government turns to the ghost in the machine, the money printer. We have reached the final stage of the debt cycle. If the American public cannot buy enough bonds to fund the deficit, and if foreign nations like China and Japan are quietly moving toward the exit, the US Treasury faces a terminal problem: an auction with no bidders. When a government needs $100 billion to pay its soldiers and social security checks, but the world only offers $80 billion, the system should, by all laws of physics, collapse. But it doesn't, because of a building in Washington, D.C. that has a power no king in history ever possessed: the Federal Reserve. In the 20th century, if a government wanted more money, they had to physically print it on paper. Today, it's much cleaner. It's just a keystroke. When the Treasury can't find a buyer for its debt, the Federal Reserve steps in. They buy the government's bonds using money that did not exist 5 seconds prior. They don't take it from taxes. They don't take it from a vault. They manufacture it out of thin air and lend it to the government. This is the ultimate ghost in the machine. The government is now borrowing money from its own central bank. To a middle-class professional in today's economy, this is known by the sophisticated name monetizing the debt. To the average person, it is known as the inflation tax. Think of it this way: the government didn't take your money out of your bank account. They simply added so much new money into the system that your existing dollars became worth less. You aren't paying the $34 trillion back through higher taxes. You are paying it back through $5 gallons of gas and a housing market that has moved permanently out of reach. Since 2008, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, the amount of debt they have bought, has exploded from less than $1 trillion to nearly $9 trillion. They have become the largest single pillar holding up the American sky. But there is a price for summoning a ghost to solve your problems. Every dollar created to buy this debt adds a new layer of heat to the economy. We are now in a race against time. Can the government grow the economy fast enough to outrun the inflation they created? Or have we reached the interest wall? We are moving to the most dangerous part of our journey, because in 2026, the free money era is officially dead. The interest on the $34 trillion is no longer a footnote. It is becoming the main event. For 20 years, the $34 trillion debt was a tomorrow problem. Interest rates were pinned at zero. Borrowing was essentially free. The government could carry a mountain of debt because the rent on that money was mere pennies. Politicians on both sides of the aisle operated under the assumption that the party would never end. But in 2026, the rent came due, and the bill is staggering. For the first time in history, the United States is spending more on interest payments than on its entire military. Think about that. Every tank, every aircraft carrier, every elite special forces unit, and every nuclear silo costs less than simply paying the service fee on old loans. This is what economists call the crowding out effect. When the government has to spend over $1 trillion just to tread water, That is money that isn't going toward cancer research, infrastructure, or education. It is dead money. It is wealth moving from the taxpayer directly into the pockets of bondholders with zero economic benefit to the public. We have entered the debt spiral. To pay the interest on the old debt, the government must borrow new money. But because interest rates are higher today than they were a decade ago, that new money is even more expensive. We are no longer borrowing to build the future. We are borrowing just to survive the past. This creates the Federal Reserve's nightmare. If the Fed lowers interest rates to save the government from bankruptcy, they risk reigniting inflation and destroying the savings of every citizen. But if they keep rates high to protect the dollar, the interest payments will eventually consume 50%, then 60% of all tax revenue. There is no soft landing behind this wall. There is only a choice between two different types of collapse. The math has become a trap with no exit. As the interest payments accelerate, the clock isn't just ticking, it's screaming.
So we return to the question that started everything. If every nation is broke, who exactly gets paid? The answer is no one, and everyone. The $34 trillion isn't a debt that will ever be paid back in the way you pay back a car loan. It is a system of perpetual rollover. It is a giant global game of musical chairs, where the music is the sound of a printing press. The system works until the one thing holding it together evaporates: trust. Right now, the world is preparing for the day that bridge collapses. China, Russia, and the world's leading central banks are accumulating gold at the fastest pace in 50 years. They aren't doing this because they like the metal. They are doing it because gold is the only asset that isn't someone else's IOU. The $34 trillion debt is a mirror. It shows us that wealth is no longer about what you have, but what people believe you can produce. As long as the world believes in the American dream, the game continues. But the day that trust breaks, the impossible number finally becomes real. The debt isn't just a number on a screen. It's a clock, and it's ticking.